The rain over Belgravia was not a storm, but a persistent, grey negotiation with the pavement, a fine mist that turned the wrought iron railings of Eaton Square into weeping sentinels. Alistair St. John Thorne watched the droplets race down the window of his Bentley, their erratic paths mimicking the fractured trajectories of the quarterly reports currently digitized on the tablet resting against his thigh. He was 38, an age that felt like a precarious ledge between the frantic ascent of youth and the long, gilded plateau of a man who had already conquered his particular corner of the world. In the boardroom, they called him the Glacier. It was a moniker born of his stillness, his ability to freeze a room with a single, unblinking stare from eyes the colour of a North Sea winter. But as the car purred toward his townhouse, Alistair felt less like ice and more like a clock whose mainspring had been wound a fraction too tight. There was a hollow resonance in his chest, a vacuum created by years of substituting intimacy for efficiency. His life was a masterpiece of curated silences, the silent glide of the lift, the silent efficiency of his housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, the silent growth of his investment portfolios. "Stop the car, Miller," Alistair said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to startle even himself. "Sir," the driver murmured, already slowing. "There," Alistair gestured toward the shadows of a recessed doorway 3 houses down from his own. Amongst the sodden rubbish sacks and the architectural grandeur of the stuccoed porch, there was a flash of incongruous colour, a bright, saturated lemon yellow. It was a mackintosh, crumpled and small, shivering with a violence that suggested the cold had long since breached the seams. Alistair stepped out before Miller could round the car with the umbrella. The London air was a damp shroud, smelling of wet soot and expensive exhaust. He approached the doorway, his bespoke leather oxfords clicking rhythmically against the stone, a sound of order encroaching upon chaos. Beneath the yellow hood was a face that seemed constructed from fine porcelain and stubbornness. She looked no more than 20, perhaps younger, her skin pulled taut over high cheekbones, her lips a bruised shade of blue. She was clutching a satchel to her chest as if it contained the last embers of a dying sun. "You're trespassing on private property," Alistair said, though the steel in his voice lacked its usual edge. He was observing the way her eyelashes, spiked with rain, cast long, trembling shadows over her cheeks. The girl looked up. Her eyes were not cowed. They were incandescent with a strange, feral defiance. "It's a doorway, not a kingdom," she rasped. Her voice was a dry leaf skittering across a patio. "And the rain doesn't care about your deeds of sale." Alistair felt a flicker of something long dormant, a spark of irritation that felt remarkably like interest. Most people spoke to him in hushed tones of supplication or studied neutrality. This girl spoke as if he were merely an obstacle between her and the sky. "You are hypothermic," he observed, stepping closer. The scent of her hit him, then not the perfume of the women he usually encountered, but the smell of damp wool, ozone, and a faint, lingering trace of peppermint. "If you stay here, the night will not be kind. My house is 2 doors down. There is tea, and there is heat." She looked at him then, really looked at him, scanning the expensive cut of his overcoat, the silver at his temples, the weary gravity of his expression. "Are you a predator or a saint?" she asked, her chin lifting, "because I have no patience for either." "I am a man who dislikes untidiness," Alistair replied, extending a hand he didn't realize was shaking, "and you are currently a very untidy blot on this street." She didn't take his hand. She stood up on her own, her limbs stiff as frozen branches, and walked toward the car with a limping, precarious dignity. That was the moment the clockwork of Alistair's life began to skip its first beat. He had picked her up, this Elara Vance, as he would later learn, like a stray piece of debris, expecting to deposit her back into the world once the weather cleared. He did not know then that she was not debris, she was a catalyst. Inside the townhouse, the transition was jarring. The foyer was a temple of minimalism white marble, a single charcoal sketch by a minimalist master, and the scent of sandalwood. Elara stood in the centre of it, dripping onto the stone, her yellow coat shedding water like a dying star. "Mrs. Gable is away for the weekend," Alistair said. Discarding his coat, he felt an odd, pulsing awareness of the space between them. "There are towels in the guest suite. Third door on the left. I shall prepare something to eat." "I don't eat much," she said, her voice regaining some of its strength. She was looking at the charcoal sketch. "That's a void," she remarked, pointing at the art. "You've framed a hole in the world and put it on your wall. Is that where you keep your soul, Mr. Thorne, Alistair Thorne, and it is a study in perspective, Miss Vance." "It's a hole," she repeated, turning her gaze to him, "but at least you're honest about it." She disappeared into the guest suite, leaving a trail of damp footprints that Alistair found himself staring at for a long time. He should have been annoyed. He should have been calling a car to take her to a shelter or a hospital. Instead, he went to the kitchen and performed the alien task of boiling water, his mind reeling with the strange, electric charge he had brought into the sterile air. He found himself thinking of his father, a man who had measured love in stock options and regarded spontaneity as a form of mental illness. Alistair had been a good student of that philosophy. He had built a fortress of routines: wake at 5, gym at 6, office by 8, a glass of 20-year-old scotch at 10, sleep at 11. It was a life of exquisite, lonely precision. When Elara emerged an hour later, she was swathed in a navy silk dressing gown he had left for her. It was far too large, the sleeves swallowed her hands, and the hem dragged on the floor. Her hair, a dark, tangled mahogany, was damp and pinned back haphazardly. She looked like a child playing dress-up in a giant's castle, yet there was an ancient, weary wisdom in her eyes that made his 38 years feel like a mere blink in time. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to the velvet sofa. He had prepared a simple meal consomme and toast. It was all his limited culinary skills could manage. She sat, but she didn't eat immediately. She watched him as he poured himself a drink. "You move like you're afraid of breaking the air," she said. "Why are you so still, Alistair?" He paused, the decanter clinking softly against the glass. "Stillness is a survival mechanism in my world. It prevents people from seeing where the cracks are." "Cracks are where the light gets in," she quoted, her voice softening. "But I think you've painted over yours so many times you've forgotten they exist." She ate then, with a focused, quiet hunger that made his chest ache. He watched the way her throat moved as she swallowed, the way her small, pale hands gripped the spoon. She was a little ancestor, a term his grandmother used for those spirits who arrived in one's life with the authority of 1,000 years, demanding to be served, to be heard, to be cared for. She was a disruption he hadn't asked for, a chaotic variable in a perfectly solved equation. "Why were you in that doorway, Elara?" She didn't look up. "The lease on my flat expired, or rather, my ability to pay it did. I'm a restorer of old things, books. Mostly, but nobody wants to fix the old anymore. They just want to buy the new and pretend the past didn't happen." "I understand that impulse," Alistair said, swirling his scotch. "The past is often an anchor." "No," she snapped, her eyes flashing. "The past is the foundation. You're living in a penthouse with no ground floor. Alistair, you're just floating in the grey." For the next 3 days, the rain did not cease, and neither did Elara's presence. She occupied his house with a terrifying, effortless grace. She moved his books. She opened windows he had kept shut for years to let the stagnant thoughts out. She played his grand piano in the middle of the night, not the sharp, precise Bach he preferred, but haunting, improvisational melodies that sounded like the city breathing. Alistair found himself leaving the office early. He found himself standing outside the door of the drawing room, listening to the shift of her movements. He was obsessed with the way she challenged him, Every word out of her mouth was a critique of his carefully constructed reality. "You have 6 clocks in this room," she told him on the 3rd evening. They were sitting by the fireplace, the orange glow dancing off the crystal carafes. "And none of them are in sync. They're all off by a few seconds. It's like a chorus of heartbeats that can't find the rhythm." "Time is relative," he said, though he was secretly bothered by the observation. He hadn't noticed the discrepancy. "Time is a gift you're hoarding," she countered. She leaned forward, the silk of the robe shimmering. "You have all this space, all this power, and you use it to build a museum for yourself. Why did you bring me here? Really?" Alistair looked into the fire. The internal monologue he had maintained for 2 decades, the one about duty, legacy, and the cold necessity of wealth, felt suddenly hollow. "I think," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "that I was tired of being the only person in the museum." "You picked me up like a fallen leaf," Elara said, her voice drifting. She stood up and walked to him, stopping just inches away. He could feel the heat radiating from her, a stark contrast to the chilled air of his usual existence. "But leaves are dead, Alistair. I am very much alive, and I am very, very difficult to keep." He reached out, his fingers brushing the silk of her sleeve, then the cold, soft skin of her wrist. He felt her pulse fast, rhythmic, a drumbeat of defiance. At 38, he was supposed to be in control. He was the Tingtai, the director of destinies. But as he looked at this girl, this little ancestor who had invaded his sanctuary, he realized he was the one being directed. "I don't want to keep you," he lied, his thumb tracing the line of her inner wrist. "I want to see what happens when the museum doors are left open." She smiled then, a slow, devastating expression that transformed her face from a mask of tragedy into something radiant. "Then prepare yourself, Alistair St. John Thorne. I'm going to make a terrible mess of your silence." Over the following weeks, the mess manifested in small, profound ways. A vase of wild, unruly cornflowers appeared on the minimalist dining table. The scent of linseed oil and old parchment began to permeate the guest suite, which she had converted into a makeshift workshop. She found an old, tattered copy of Keats in his library and spent hours meticulously ray-binding it, her small hands moving with a reverence he had only ever seen applied to high-stakes contracts. Alistair's colleagues noticed the change. "You look distracted," Alistair, his partner, Marcus, had remarked during a merger meeting. "You missed a decimal point in the valuation. That's not like you." Alistair had looked at the screen, but instead of numbers, he saw the way Elara's hair looked when she was frustrated, a wild halo of mahogany. He saw the way she tucked one foot under her when she sat on the floor to read. "I'm merely recalibrating," Alistair had replied, but the words felt like a foreign language. He was falling into a strange, domestic orbit. He began to crave the moments when he returned home to find her arguing with the thermostat or humming to herself in the kitchen. She treated him not as a titan of industry, but as a slightly dense student who needed to be taught the basics of being human. "You drink your coffee too fast," she would scold. "You're treating it like fuel. It's a conversation with the morning. Slow down." And he did. He slowed down until he could hear the sound of his own heart, a sound he had ignored for years. One evening, he found her in the library. Standing on a ladder, she was reaching for a high shelf, her body stretched thin, the light of the chandelier catching the gold in her eyes. "Careful," he said, moving to steady the ladder. She looked down at him, her expression unreadable. "You're always trying to steady things, Alistair. Sometimes things need to fall. They need to break so you can see what they're made of." "I've seen enough things break," he said, his hand resting on her ankle. The touch was electric, a grounding wire for the storm that had been building in his chest. "I'd rather keep this intact." "This," she whispered. "What is this?" "The feeling that I am no longer waiting for the end of the day," he admitted. The confession felt like a physical weight leaving his body. The feeling that the silence in this house has finally been filled with something other than ghosts. Elara climbed down the ladder slowly, her eyes locked on his. When she stood on the floor, she didn't pull away, she stepped into his space, her forehead resting against his chest. "You're a very expensive, very lonely man," she murmured, "but you're a good man, Alistair, even if you've tried very hard to hide it." He wrapped his arms around her, a gesture that felt both protective and desperate. He was a man of 38, a man of logic and steel, and he was being undone by a girl he had found in a rainy doorway. She was his little ancestor, his precious trouble, the one who had come to claim the debt he owed to his own soul. The metaphor of the foundling was no longer sufficient. She wasn't something he had rescued, she was the rescuer. In the quiet of the Belgravia night, with the rain finally tapping a gentle rhythm against the glass, Alistair realized that his life hadn't been a masterpiece at all. It had been a sketch, waiting for someone to add the color, the chaos, and the light. He pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face. "Stay," he said. It wasn't a command, it was a plea. Elara smiled, and for the first time, there was no defiance in it, only a soft, shimmering promise. "I'll stay for now," she said, "but you have to promise me one thing." "Anything." "Get rid of those 6 clocks. We're going to live by a different kind of time from now on." Alistair laughed, a sound that was rusty, unfamiliar, and entirely genuine. He felt the weight of the years, the weight of his status, the weight of the Glacier persona, all melting away into the warmth of the room. He had picked up a little ancestor, and in doing so, he had finally found his way home. The Tinktai was no longer a man of ice, he was a man of the rain, the hearth, and the beautiful, unpredictable mess of a life shared. As they stood there, the shadows of the library seemed to soften. The minimalist art on the walls no longer looked like voids, they looked like blank pages, waiting to be written upon. The clock in the hallway struck the hour out of sync, imperfect and perfectly, wonderfully alive. The silence that followed her request was not the hollow, ringing void Alistair Thorne had cultivated for a decade. It was a textured thing, heavy with the scent of old paper and the faint, citrus-sharp note of the tea Elara had brewed earlier. He looked at the 6 clocks masterpieces of horology, each ticking with a precise, cold mechanical heart, and felt a sudden, visceral exhaustion. For years, he had lived by the millisecond, carving his life into manageable segments of profit and loss, ensuring that not a single heartbeat was wasted on the unpredictable. But as he looked at Elara Vance, standing there with her chin tilted in that characteristic blend of defiance and grace, the ticking sound began to feel like a countdown to a life he no longer wanted to lead. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cold brass of the nearest timepiece, a carriage clock that had belonged to a grandfather he barely remembered. With a slow, deliberate motion, he turned the key until the mechanism groaned and went still. The sudden absence of its rhythmic pulse felt like a physical release, a loosening of a corset around his lungs. "One," Elara whispered, her voice a soft friction in the quiet room. Alistair moved to the next, a sleek, minimalist digital display that glowed with a sterile blue light. He pressed the power button until the screen faded to black. He felt a strange, light-headed sensation, as if he were unmooring a ship from a dock it had been lashed to for a century. He was Alistair Thorne, the man whose name was synonymous with the ironclad stability of the London markets, yet here he was, dismantling his own fortress at the behest of a girl who had entered his life like a sudden, unseasonable storm. He wondered, briefly, what his board of directors would think if they could see him now. They saw the Glacier, the man who could devalue a currency with a flick of his pen. They didn't see the man who spent his nights wondering if the echo in his hallways was the sound of his own pulse or the ghost of the person he might have been. "You're thinking too much again," Elara said, stepping closer. She didn't touch him, but her presence was a warmth that radiated through the fine wool of his waistcoat. I can hear the gears grinding. Stop trying to calculate the cost of the silence, Alistair. It's free. I have never known how to handle things that are free, he admitted, his voice rasping. In my world, if something has no price, it usually has no value. Then you've been living in a very small world, she replied, her eyes searching his. He finished the task, silencing the remaining clocks until the library was truly quiet, a silence so profound he could hear the distant, muffled hum of a black cab on the wet tarmac of Elizabeth Street. He turned to her, his hands trembling slightly, a sensation so foreign he almost didn't recognize it as his own. He felt stripped, exposed, as if the clocks had been a suit of armor he had finally discarded. The following morning, the sun struggled to pierce the persistent London fog, casting the Belgravia townhouse in a bruised, pearlescent light. Alistair woke not to the aggressive chirp of an alarm, but to the smell of burnt toast and the sound of a radio playing a melancholic cello concerto downstairs. He lay still for a long time, watching the dust motes dance in a stray beam of light. Usually, by this hour, he had checked the Nikkei, dictated 3 memos, and was halfway through a protein shake that tasted of chalk and ambition. Today, he felt a lethargic curiosity about the burnt toast. He dressed slowly, choosing a jumper of charcoal cashmere instead of his usual bespoke pinstripe. When he descended the stairs, he found Elara in the kitchen, her hair tied back with a piece of kitchen twine, her face smudged with flour. She looked up, her expression shifting from concentration to a soft, teasing smile. "You look unbuttoned," she remarked, sliding a plate of charred bread toward him. "It suits you, less like a statue, more like a human being who might actually enjoy a Sunday." "It's Tuesday, Elara," he said, though there was no bite in the correction. "Is it? I hadn't noticed. The clocks are dead, remember." She leaned against the marble counter, watching him with an intensity that made him feel as though she were reading the fine print of his soul. "What are you going to do today, Alistair? Not for the company, not for the legacy, for you." He looked at the toast, then at her. The question was a trapdoor. He had spent his entire adult life building a legacy because he was terrified of what would be left if the scaffolding was removed. He thought of his office in the city, the glass walls that looked out over the Thames, the rows of subordinates who waited for his word as if it were scripture. It all felt incredibly far away, like a film he had watched a long time ago. "I think," he said, the words forming as he spoke them, "that I would like to go for a walk, somewhere where people don't know my name." They ended up in the Chelsea Physic Garden, tucked away behind high brick walls. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and medicinal herbs. Alistair walked with his hands in his pockets, his shoulders dropping an inch for every block they moved away from his house. Beside him, Elara was a whirlwind of observation, pointing out the jagged edges of a leaf or the way a particular bird seemed to be scolding a squirrel. He found himself watching her more than the greenery. She moved with a freedom he envied, a lack of self-consciousness that was both beautiful and terrifying. To be so untethered seemed like a recipe for disaster, yet she appeared more grounded than he had ever been. "Why did you stay?" he asked abruptly, stopping beside a gnarled olive tree that looked as if it had survived 1,000 winters. "That night in the rain, you could have gone to a shelter or called someone. Why did you let me bring you home?" Elara stopped, her gaze drifting to the grey sky. "I saw your eyes, Alistair. You looked like you were drowning in a very expensive ocean. I thought maybe I could be a piece of driftwood." She turned to him, her expression turning serious. "And because I knew you wouldn't ask for anything I wasn't willing to give, you're a man of rules, even when you're being a rescuer. I felt safer with your rules than with the world's chaos." "My rules are crumbling," he murmured, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on the soft skin of her temple. Good, she whispered. Rules are just fences we build because we're afraid of the horizon. In that moment, the power dynamic he had so carefully maintained, the benefactor and the waif, the titan and the foundling, evaporated. He wasn't her protector, he was her pupil. He was a man of 38 who was finally learning the vocabulary of his own emotions, guided by a girl who owned nothing but had everything he lacked. As they walked back toward the gate, Alistair's phone vibrated in his pocket. It was Julian Halloway, his chief of staff, likely calling about the merger. Usually, the vibration felt like a call to arms, a surge of adrenaline that propelled him into the fray. Now, it felt like an intrusion, a shrill reminder of a ghost's life. He took the phone out, looked at the flickering name on the screen, and did something he had never done in his professional career. He switched it off. What was that? Elara asked, a mischievous glint in her eyes. The sound of a fence falling down, Alistair replied. The walk home felt shorter, the streets of London appearing more vibrant, as if someone had turned up the saturation on a monochrome photograph. But beneath the newfound lightness, a shadow of anxiety began to curl in his chest. He knew that the world would not let him go so easily. The Glacier had responsibilities, debts, and a reputation that acted as a gravity well. He looked at Elara, laughing at a shop window display, and felt a sudden, sharp pang of protectiveness. He had met Gigi picked up a little ancestor, a girl who demanded he respect the past while living in the present, but in doing so, he had made himself vulnerable. For the first time in his life, Alistair Thorne had something to lose that couldn't be replaced by a bank transfer. He wasn't just afraid for himself anymore. He was afraid for the fragile, beautiful thing they were building in the silence of his clockless house. When they reached the front door of the Belgravia house, the evening shadows were stretching long across the pavement. Alistair paused, his hand on the heavy brass knocker. "Elara," he said, his voice low. She turned, her face illuminated by the amber glow of a street lamp. "Yes. Tomorrow I have to go back, just for a few hours. There are things I need to settle, to make sure we're safe." She searched his face, her smile fading into something more contemplative. "Just don't bring the clocks back with you, Alistair. I don't think I could survive the ticking again." "I promise," he said, and for the first time in his life, the word felt like a sacred oath rather than a contractual obligation. He opened the door, and as they stepped into the warm, silent hallway, he realized that he wasn't just returning to his house, he was arriving at a threshold. Behind him lay the cold, measured perfection of his old life. Ahead lay a territory without maps, filled with the potential for breakage and the certainty of breath. He looked at the empty spaces on the walls where the clocks had once hung, and for the first time, he didn't see a void, he saw a beginning. That night, as the rain returned to drum a soft, irregular beat against the library windows, Alistair sat in the dark, listening to the house breathe. He thought about the valuation error in the merger meeting, the decimal point that had slipped because he was thinking of mahogany hair. He realized now that it hadn't been an error at all. It had been his subconscious trying to tell him that the math of his life no longer added up. He was no longer a man of steel. He was a man of flesh and bone, of fear and hope, and as he heard Elara's light footsteps on the floor above, he knew that the debt he owed to his own soul was finally being paid. One silent second at a time. The morning arrived not with the shrill insistence of an alarm, but with the tentative grey light of a London dawn creeping through the heavy velvet curtains of the master bedroom. Alistair lay still, his heart beating a rhythm that felt entirely disconnected from the cold efficiency of the previous decade. For years, his first conscious thought had been a mental spreadsheet, a cascade of figures and risks that required immediate mitigation. Today, the space in his mind was occupied by the memory of Elara's laughter echoing against the stripped walls of the library. He dressed with a mechanical precision that felt like donning an old, uncomfortable costume, The silk tie, knotted into a perfect Windsor, felt like a silken noose. The bespoke charcoal suit, once his armor against the chaos of the markets, now seemed like a heavy, suffocating hide. He looked at himself in the full-length mirror, the sharp jaw, the eyes that people called glacial, and saw a stranger wearing the skin of a man who had died a week ago. Downstairs, the kitchen was bathed in the soft, milky glow of the overcast sky. Elara was already there, perched on the edge of the marble island, cradling a mug of tea as if it were a fragile bird. She wore one of his oversized cashmere sweaters. The sleeves swallowed her hands, making her look even smaller, even more like a disruption in the sterile geometry of his life. "You look like you're going to war," she said softly, her gaze tracing the sharp lines of his lapels. "In a way, I am," Alistair replied, pouring himself a coffee he didn't truly want. "The city expects a certain version of me. If I show up as anything else, the vultures will start circling before the first cup of coffee is poured." "Then don't be a version of you," she said. Hopping down from the stool, she walked over to him, her bare feet silent on the heated stone floor. She reached up and purposefully tugged at his tie, loosening the knot just enough to ruin its clinical perfection. "Be the man who threw the clocks away. He's much more interesting than the one who owns the bank." Alistair felt a strange, fluttering sensation in his chest, a localized earthquake of the soul. The man who threw the clocks away doesn't know how to sign a £3 billion merger, Elara. Maybe he shouldn't sign it. Then she countered, her eyes bright with a terrifying kind of honesty. He left the house feeling as though he were leaving the only air he could breathe. His car, a silent, obsidian black Bentley, waited at the curb. Arthur, his driver of 12 years, opened the door with the usual stoic deference, but Alistair caught the man's eyes lingering for a fraction of a second on the loosened tie. In the silence of the back seat, the city of London blurred past a grey-green montage of Chelsea embankments and the towering glass needles of the financial district. The headquarters of Thorne and Associates sat atop one of those needles, a temple of steel and hubris. As Alistair stepped into the lobby, the atmosphere shifted. It was the air of high-stakes calculation, scented with expensive floor wax and the invisible ozone of digital transactions. People stopped. They nodded. They whispered. The Glacier had returned. Julian Halloway was waiting in the executive suite, pacing like a caged panther. Julian was 42, fueled by espresso and the singular desire to be Alistair Thorne. "Alistair, thank God," Julian said, his voice a frantic staccato. "The Germans are twitchy. The valuation on the Frankfurt assets came in 3 points lower than our projection. And they're trying to use it as leverage to retain the board seats. I've prepped the rebuttal. We need to crush them by noon, or the whole thing goes sideways." Alistair walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. Below him, the Thames looked like a sluggish, brown snake. From this height, the people were nothing but ants, their lives invisible, their stories irrelevant. He had spent his entire adult life at this altitude, looking down, measuring the world in terms of its utility to his bottom line. "Alistair, did you hear me?" Julian's voice was closer now, laced with a thin veneer of concern. You're not wearing your watch." Alistair looked at his bare wrist. The skin there was paler than the rest of his arm, a ghostly mark of the burden he had carried for 20 years. "I don't need to know what time it is, Julian. The time for what we're doing here has already passed." "What is that supposed to mean?" "The board is waiting. The contracts are printed. This is the pinnacle, Alistair. This is what you've built everything for." "I built a cage," Alistair said, his voice low and resonant, carrying a weight that made Julian flinch. "I built a cage out of gold and glass, and I've been sitting inside it, counting the bars, convinced I was the master of the zoo." He turned away from the view and looked at Julian. Truly looked at him. He saw the frantic twitch in the younger man's eyelid, the sweat on his upper lip, the hollow hunger in his eyes. He saw himself, 10 years ago, and felt a profound, aching pity. "The merger is off," Alistair said. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum, a sudden removal of all the pressure that kept the corporate world from collapsing. "You're joking," Julian whispered, a nervous laugh bubbling in his throat. "It's a joke, a psychological tactic for the meeting, right? I'm going to liquidate my majority stake in the holding company," Alistair continued, his voice calm, almost conversational. "I'll set up a trust for the employees, and I'll leave you to manage the transition. You want this world. Julian, you want the height and the noise and the numbers. You can have them, but I'm going home." "Home," Julian spat the word as if it were an insult. "To that mausoleum in Belgravia." "To what?" "Alistair. To sit in the dark and wait for the end. You're at the top, there's nowhere else to go." "I found someone," Alistair said, and the mere thought of Elara felt like a warm hand on his shoulder. "Someone who showed me that the top is just a place where the air is too thin to live. I've spent my life in GGC picking up assets. Julian, companies, properties, reputations, but I finally picked up something that I can't put a price on, and I'm not going to let it wither, because I was too busy watching the clock." He walked past Julian, past the mahogany desks and the shimmering screens, past the assistants who froze like statues as he moved. He felt lighter with every step, as if he was shedding layers of heavy, leaden armor. By the time he reached the lift, he was almost running. The descent felt like a rebirth. When the doors opened onto the street, the noise of London hit him, the sirens, the shouts, the grinding of gears, but it no longer felt like a cacophony he had to control. It felt like a symphony he was finally allowed to hear. He didn't call Arthur. He walked through the crowded streets of the city, his expensive shoes clicking on the pavement, his suit jacket flapping in the wind. He saw a flower stall on a corner in Covent Garden, a riot of colour against the grey stone. He stopped and bought a massive, chaotic bouquet of wild flowers, weeds and sunflowers. They were messy and uncoordinated, and entirely unsuitable for a man of his stature. They were perfect. As he turned onto his street in Belgravia, the anxiety that had curled in his chest the night before began to dissipate. He realized that the glacier hadn't melted, it had broken. And from the wreckage, something green and stubborn was starting to grow. He reached the front door and paused, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for his keys. He realized he didn't want to use them. He wanted to knock. He wanted to be invited in, not as the master of the house, but as a guest in a new life. He struck the brass knocker, 3 firm, clear sounds. The door opened a few moments later. Elara stood there, her hair a wild halo in the hallway light. She looked at his dishevelled suit, his crooked tie, and the ridiculous explosion of flowers in his arms. Her eyes widened, and then a slow, radiant smile spread across her face, a smile that held more light than any boardroom in the world. "You're early," she whispered. "No," Alistair replied, stepping over the threshold and leaving the shadow of the Titan behind him. "I think I'm exactly on time." The threshold was a boundary more significant than any border he had crossed in a private jet. As Alistair stepped into the hallway, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him, the sound was not a slamming of a lid but the sealing of a tomb, the burial of Alistair Sterling. The Titan of industry, the Glacier of the city. The man who remained stood in the dim, amber glow of the foyer, clutching a bouquet of sunflowers and weeds like a shield. He felt raw, as though he had been flayed by the wind on the walk from Covent Garden, his skin sensitive to the very air of the house. Elara did not move immediately. She remained framed by the doorway to the morning room, her presence a quiet, steady pulse against the frantic rhythm of his heart. She wore a thick, oversized jumper of oatmeal-coloured wool, the sleeves pulled down over her knuckles, and in the soft light, the sharp edges of her past, the hunger, the fear. The defensive grit seemed to have softened into something luminous. "You look," she began, her voice trailing off into a small, melodic laugh that caught in the quiet of the high-ceilinged hall, "like you've just lost a war and won a kingdom." Alistair looked down at his shoes. They were scuffed. He couldn't remember the last time he had allowed his footwear to be anything less than a mirror. "I suppose I have," he said, and the words felt like pebbles dropped into a deep well. "I gave it all to Julian, or rather, I gave him the keys to the cage. I suspect he'll find it quite comfortable until he realizes the locks work both ways." He stepped forward, offering the flowers. They were a riotous, unkempt mess, shedding golden pollen onto the Persian rug. "I didn't know what you liked. The florist suggested roses, but they felt too calculated. These looked like they had a mind of their own." Elara took them, her fingers brushing his. The contact was electric. A grounding wire for the static electricity still hummed in his veins from the boardroom confrontation. She buried her face in the blooms, inhaling the scent of sun-baked earth and wild stalks. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, searching his face with an intensity that made him want to confess every sin of his 40-odd years. "They're perfect," she whispered. "They look like they've survived a storm." "I think we both have." They moved into the kitchen, a room that had once been a sterile galley of high-end appliances Alistair never touched. Now it smelled of cinnamon and tea. There was a flowery thumbprint on the marble counter, a sign of Elara's presence, of a life being lived rather than a lifestyle being curated. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Alistair sat at the heavy wooden table, his limbs feeling strangely heavy, as if the gravity of the world had finally caught up to him now that he was no longer trying to outrun it. He watched her move, the way she found a Vasa Minera piece he'd bought for its investment value and filled it with water, unceremoniously shoving the wild flowers into it. She didn't care about the provenance of the porcelain, she cared that it held the water for the life he had brought her. "What happens now?" she asked, leaning against the counter, her gaze fixed on him. "The news will be everywhere by morning. The Glacier melts. Sterling abandons ship. They'll come for interviews. They'll want to know why." Alistair leaned back, the wood of the chair creaking a sound of structural honesty. "Let them wonder. I've spent my life being a character in other people's stories, the ruthless CEO, the cold-hearted bachelor, the master of the deal. I'm retiring the character, tomorrow. I think I'd like to see the park, not through the window of a car, but on foot. I want to see the way the light hits the Serpentine at noon." He reached out, his hand resting palm up on the table. It was an invitation, a vulnerability he would have found unthinkable a month ago. Elara crossed the kitchen and placed her hand in his. Her skin was warm, a stark contrast to the cold metal of the pens he had been signing contracts with all morning. "I was a pickup, wasn't I?" she said softly, her thumb tracing the line of his knuckles. "A stray asset you found in the rain, an investment you didn't know what to do with." Alistair shook his head, his voice thickening with a sudden, profound emotion. "No, I thought I was picking you up. Elara, I thought I was the one doing the saving, but as I walked through the city today, I realized the truth. I was the one drowning in an inch of water. You were the one who reached down. You were the only thing in my life that wasn't a transaction." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't the suffocating silence of his old life. It was a fertile silence, like the earth in winter, holding the secret of the spring to come. He thought of the board members, their faces frozen in various states of horror and greed, and he felt a distant, fading pity for them. They were still trapped in the machinery, grinding themselves into dust for the sake of a percentage point. He looked at Elara, really looked at her, and saw the map of a new world in her eyes. There would be difficulties, he knew. The transition from a life of absolute power to one of quiet domesticity would not be without its tremors. He would have to learn how to be a person again, how to exist without the scaffolding of a corporation to hold him upright. He would have to learn how to be Alistair, The man who liked wildflowers and silence and the way the light caught the red in a girl's hair. "I'm not a Titan anymore," he said, almost to himself. Elara smiled, and it was a look of such devastating kindness that he felt the last of the ice within him shatter. "Good," she said, her voice a gentle command. "I never much liked heights anyway. It's much warmer down here." Outside, the sun began its slow descent over the London skyline, casting long, bruised shadows across the rooftops of Belgravia. The city continued its roar, the commerce, the ambition, the relentless pursuit of more, but inside the house, the noise had faded to a whisper. Alistair stood up and took off his suit jacket, draping it over the back of the chair. He loosened his tie, pulling it free and letting it fall to the floor like a discarded snakeskin. He felt the weight of his years, the ache of his choices, but for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to fix it. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. He reached for her, and she stepped into his arms, a small, fierce heat against his chest. He closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of her, of wool and wild flowers and the terrifying, beautiful unknown. The merger was off. The assets were gone. The empire was someone else's burden now. He had met Gigi, he had found his soul, and he was finally, irrevocably home.